I'm so glad to see so many familiar faces and some new faces or names on the Zoom. It's great to have you. It would be great if very quickly folks could put their name and their organization in the chat, just so we can sort of get a sense of who's here. We have a lot of material to get through in a fast 60 minutes, so we can't have you all introduce yourselves, but it would be great to have you do that. I would also just love to really take just a moment to acknowledge that this is just one of a whole host of conversations that are happening in our community and in our state around the issue of revenue. It is a beginning and foundational conversation, so by no means the conversation or the only one. We're excited to have partners participating in here. I think it is also sort of deeply gratifying to know that we have a number of our elected officials and state staff that are on the conversation, and also just want to highlight the support of the Children's Cabinet in this conversation. I also want to just acknowledge those who are supporting us in our collective efforts. So wanted to just acknowledge the Alliance for Early Childhood Success as a key supporter of this effort. Many members of the Start Early Funders Coalition, many on this call, who are also supporting many of us in the effort. And we're just very excited to engage in this conversation. I think for those of us who've been working in early childhood care and education, we have for a very long time been sort of nickel and diming it, trying to get by with what little resources we have. We've been continuing to live with some of the cuts. Nan Madden reminded me today of the cuts that had happened in the mid-2000s that we still feel the effects of today. So we are excited to engage in a conversation with you all, and ones that you are already supporting on the issue of revenue. And I just want to make sure that we are not proposing in this conversation things that our state has not already done. The very founding of the Children's Cabinet came in 1996 with a desire to bring a cabinet together, but also to think about funding. And although the funding piece never quite happened in the way that we had hoped, that was sort of some of the impetus of this. I think the business community has long been supporting a call for funding early childhood care and education, because we know the explicit links between early care education and our economy. We also have seen examples like the Legacy Amendment, which really provides a steady source of revenue for folks in the arts. And I think that there's also the Healthcare Access Fund, which has really helped to underpin and support healthcare access to children and families in low-income households. And so we know that these are opportunities that exist in our community, and it just seems to me that it is time, certainly, for us to be able to move forward and proceed in this way. I'm going to stop talking because I feel like I'm the least of it here today. And we have so many wonderful speakers here that have joined us today. But want to turn it over back to Laura to move us forward.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate all that. We are going to dive right in. Thank you again for anyone who's joining us now. Go ahead and put your name and organization in the chat box. We'll add the public agenda as well. But I am happy to introduce Elizabeth Gaines. She's the founder and director of the Children's Funding Budget. And she has been doing this type of work and thinking about generating revenue and supporting children and families in a number of ways. So Elizabeth, I'm going to be forwarding your slides. So thank you very much for joining us.
Great. I'm glad to be here. And by the way, Children's Funding Project. I've heard it all too, by the way, the Children's Finance Project, Children's Funding Budget, whatever. Doesn't matter. As long as funding is in there. So, Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all. And my hope is that some of you maybe heard a recent webinar we did for the Alliance for Early Success, where the whole theme was growing the size of the pie versus, really continuing to fight for a little slice of pie for kids. And I'm a lifelong child advocate, so I know all about fighting for a little slice of the pie. And I'm like, we've got to change our mindset. We've got to start thinking about this differently. So founded the Children's Funding Project to just be laser focused on growing the size of the pie for kids. The things that we do, I'm not going to get into great detail on, but just to give you a sense, we use these 4 policy levers to think about financing for children and youth. And the first one is really that basic sort of fiscal mapping, getting a handle on what funding you currently have and what's being spent in your state or community on kids, and really understanding the characteristics of those funding streams. We've got lots and lots of examples of that. I've even worked on those with Laura in the past in various places in Minnesota. The align lever is something that your governor's children's cabinet is really working on. How do we take all these disparate siloed systems that we have for kids and think about them in a more holistic way? Generate is what we want to focus on here today, obviously, and so we'll get into great detail on that. And you're actually going to hear from Dana Hepper in Oregon about that specific Oregon example, and I probably have the numbers wrong, Dana, so you can correct me. And activate is this notion that once you have a new large infusion of public resources, you've got to make sure that you're being good stewards of those resources. And I put Kansas on here as an example just because many of you who've been around for a long time like me will remember the master settlement agreement from the tobacco company, and in Kansas, they did a really good job, I think, of saying, okay, we're going to take that money, dedicate it, and set it aside and protect it. And so that was just sort of a good state example from my perspective. So you can hop to the next slide. So again, I'm going to hone in on generate here for a second, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this bottom line because you all know it intimately. And we know that the systems are underfunded. We know that it's deeply inequitable who gets access to high quality. And the thing that we maybe know, but sometimes forget, is that there is overwhelming voter support for public funding for kids, specifically childcare right now. And we can talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But if you go to the next slide. On this equity issue, I just want to reinforce that we're looking at a number of layers of inequity, right? So we've got sort of economic inequity, obviously, and somebody mentioned the cuts in the mid-2000s that came after the Great Recession. A lot of early childhood funding that existed at that time never got replaced. And so we're about to go into another scenario like that. And if you think about it, we've got to have that baseline understanding of what we were spending in 2019 so that we can not only spend that again in 2021 and beyond, but make sure we're growing the size of the pie, because we cannot afford to go back in time again from what happened the last time. So that's economic inequity is happening where, it's really going to hit, the lowest income among us the hardest if that is what happens. Geographic inequity is a real issue, and I'm sure you experience that throughout the state in different parts of the state, right? There's just, very different access to high quality opportunities depending on, whether you're in a childcare desert or not. The obvious inequity that we are all, really trying to reckon with as a country is racial inequity. And we know who is going to be hit the hardest, and it's going to be a compounding of the geographic, the economic, and the racial inequity. So I won't say any more about that because we all know all about that at this point. But let's move to the next slide. So again, we can go to the next slide. This was the best image I had of how do you actually grow a pie, because a pie is the size of a pie. So we've got to grow the pie. Well, one of the things that I want us to do as a field, and pause here for a moment just to think about your own mindset, is really shift from this scarcity mindset that we've been operating under. And I think it's because we're nice, we're childcare workers, we're teachers, we're social workers, we're people trying to advocate for our littlest people. but we're doing it in a way that is maybe trying to be too nice. And we have abundance in this country, and it is clear. I mean, this is just to give you a quick reminder and example. You know, there is great abundance that has been happening even in this country during COVID, right? This is just growth in certain, you know, few folks' income during COVID. So, you know, when people tell you now's not the right moment, we couldn't possibly do this right now, you know, I think there are ways we need to get creative about how to shift some of the resources. So if you go to the next slide, this is just to remind us all that, you know, there is actually bipartisan support. And I sat down, you know, when we finally sort of learned the results of the national election to think about what does this mean for what we're trying to do with the Children's Funding Project from a state and local perspective. And I think what we saw is this is not the blue wave country, it's not the red wave country, but we had a little bit, and I'll show you in a second, of a children's wave. So I'll show you that if you hop to the next slide. The next slide is just to say that we're in a window right now where the public, everybody in the public, you know, especially anybody in the middle class who has kids right now, right, who you kind of have to capture their hearts and minds a little bit to win politically, they get that childcare is an essential service. And so, you know, we have this moment where we need to be securing the resources for this essential service right now. So if you go to the next one, this is just to tell you that, you know, despite what happened at the national level, this notion of a little bit of a children's wave that happened is real, but it happened at the local level. So it happened down ballot. You know, I think 17% is maybe the level of faith that people have in the federal government right now. It's really a deplorable amount of faith we have in, shouldn't use that word, deplorable, but it's a low level of faith we have in the federal government right now. But you can see, you know, we have still quite a bit of faith in our state governments, and then even more faith in our local governments to solve problems. And so if you go to the next slide, this is to tell you before November, before this most recent election, this is the number of places that have gone to their voters locally and said, should we tax ourselves to pay for children's services? And this many places around the country have done it. And sometimes people will assume it's just going to be on the coasts, you know, it's not. It's in red states, it's in blue states, it's in rural areas, it's in urban areas. People are willing to do this in their community. If you go to the next slide, this is what we were super excited and heartened by. We actually supported 6, 7, 8 maybe down ballot measures to do exactly that this November. And, you know, we thought going into it, wow, we don't know, it's a pandemic, you know, there's potential recession that we're looking at. Should we be doing this? 5 of these places had a natural disaster in October, a fire or a hurricane or whatever. Every single one of them passed. And they did it with between 60 and 70% of the vote. So I'm just here to tell you, like, before you sort of poo-poo this idea and say, oh, we couldn't possibly do this right now, I just want to implore you to think about, you know, some of the options that are out there. If you go to the next slide, tell me, Laura, cut me off when I need to be cut off. This is just to say, as much as I'm telling you that local strategy is a big winner, it is, but we can't do it on the backs of local communities alone. Obviously, it's got to be state money. It's got to be federal money. We already know that the out of pocket that parents are paying is stretching them as thin as they possibly can go. And then, you know, the private sector money is important, but needs to be sort of leverage money in a lot of ways, because I just don't think we're going to get there otherwise. So going to the next slide. This is the piece that, like, I want to make sure we get to real quick here is there are, and I know you're going to have some folks who've done this in Minnesota and looked at what the revenue raising options might be. We did this paper that folks should dig into at some point with the folks at Build called Funding Our Future. And we really walked through a bunch of these different mechanisms. Dana was in the work group. There were a bunch of people in the work group from out across the country who helped us comb through all of the examples and ways that people were using new revenue to pay for early childhood. If you hop to the next slide, this basically is my pull from the work that the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy did to look at each state and what, based on your state constitution and various state statutes and rules, what might be possible in Minnesota. So, you know, I hope that the folks who are doing the revenue research in Minnesota have all of these things on your list. I keep telling people, don't rule anything out until you've actually like run a battery of questions against each of these revenue options. And so if you go to the next slide, and we can always come back to this if we need to. If you go, this slide is some of the guiding questions that we're trying to get people to think about before they rule anything out, right? So understanding what the right jurisdiction level for a particular type of tax might be, obviously understanding if it's legally feasible. Can it be dedicated? This is a big question because, you know, we've all had these moments of being burned by commitments of revenue to certain things that then, especially in tough times, you know, get withheld or you know, what have you. So we care a lot about the dedicatability of the funding. Is it politically feasible? And before, you know, we kind of just have a knee-jerk reaction of like, no, couldn't possibly. I would just encourage getting through all of the questions on it. And then understanding the progressivity or the regressivity of the tax is very important because obviously when you think about taxes, who pays as a proportional share matters. And so for instance, a sales tax is certainly more regressive because everybody pays that every time they go out to buy anything, right? And so it's going to hit people with a lower income at a greater way than it will hit somebody with a higher income. So we want to make sure that we're considering the most progressive options possible. Now, in some states, it's not possible to do anything but a sales tax. And so you have to weigh that as a criteria. Communication power, is it related somehow to early care and education? Who pays for the tax versus who benefits from the tax is another way of getting at that fairness and equity question. Is it timely? And so, you know, that can mean a lot of different things. And then how does it fit into your long-term strategy? You know, if it's a revenue stream that maybe is only going to generate, you know, $15 million a year for the state, right? That isn't going to get it done, but does it fit into, can you buy something with that particular revenue stream that's going to help you along your path of your long-term strategy? So that is just to sort of plant the seed of some questions you might want to ask about the various revenue streams. I hope I planted a seed that it's not a non-starter to talk about this. And if anyone is still convinced, I'd love to talk with you about it more. So I'll wait until the Q&A part, Laura.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been super helpful to get us thinking about all of this. Just for people that don't know, Elizabeth has worked with a number of our communities in Minnesota and with our children's cabinet as well. So she is familiar with what we are doing here. So we're just grateful to have you join us. Okay, so next we're going to move along. Dana Hepper is the Policy Advocate and Advocacy Director at Children's Institute in Oregon. And Dana, you will need to unmute yourself to join. And then Elizabeth, if you want to mute yourself until the Q&A, that'd be great.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dana Hepper. I work for the Children's Institute in Oregon, and I'm here to talk to you about the Oregon Student Success Act primarily, which was a piece of legislation we were part of a coalition to help pass in the 2019 legislative session that has dedicated funding for early childhood programs. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our context for passing that legislation, who our partners were, and what we did together. And finally, what we won and how it's paid for. So you can advance, Laura. So just a little bit about our context. Leading into the 2019 legislative session, I would have to say Oregon's early childhood advocacy was very fractured. And so, you know, it's not like we were necessarily fighting against each other, but just everyone was going in and lobbying for their own funding stream. So you'd have the Head Start lobby day, and Head Start would come in and talk about the joys of Head Start and why the state needed to invest. And relief nurseries or in child abuse prevention, and they would come in and talk about relief nurseries. And then Children's Institute would be there a different day talking about state pre-K. And then, you know, our special education directors would come in and talk about the need for early childhood special education services. So all of that was happening. We were each doing our own advocacy, and, you know, as good as advocates as we could be for our programs and funding streams that were a priority to us. But to legislators, it was a hot mess. It was a hodgepodge. They didn't understand how these things work together to form a comprehensive system. It sounded like a lot of duplicative funding streams that probably weren't getting the job done. And our funding successes kind of reflected that ineffective coordination amongst us. So in 2018, early in 2018, the legislature announced that they would form a student success committee, a new joint bicameral bipartisan committee of the legislature to focus on finding out what works in public education and how to pay for it. And we quickly knew this was a huge opportunity. They were going to raise taxes, or at least that was the plan. If they raise taxes now, they probably wouldn't want to do it a lot in the future. It would probably be a few years. And so we wanted to get early childhood in the mix right away. So we started convening a group. It actually started December of 2017. Then all through 2018, we started meeting, and we just started by inviting a few more of the partners. It sounds like you already have a coalition in Minnesota, so you may already be around the table. But we just organically, you know, we invited 12 people who invited 12 more, and now we've got more than 40 partners at the Early Childhood Coalition table. And really our purpose was to get early childhood in this Student Success Act conversation, have a role in shaping how it was included, how much money, and for what investments. And so that's what we did. The committee was touring the state, and we were coordinating our messaging. We were turning people out to local community meetings to talk about early childhood. We were giving them some common messages and talking points to use, so legislators would be hit with the same point no matter what community they were in. We were asking legislators to include early childhood programs on the committee's tour of the state, so they would be in buildings with children watching this work underway, and just making sure we were included along the way. So when the time for the discussion of the specifics came, early childhood was a natural inclusion, and we were successful in that endeavor. As session began, that shared advocacy and strategy needed to continue. And quickly you saw legislators, I think because of our past fractured advocacy, you saw them pivot to kind of the program they knew or the funding stream they were an advocate for. And so they were starting to talk, and they're like, well, some of this money should definitely go to preschool. Also, if I think about school readiness and who a student is, I don't think of a baby, but I think of a preschooler. That fits into my box. And at that point, as the organization and individual convening the coalition, I got really nervous because it would be easy for the programs that were getting picked to break off and be like, well, we got ours, good luck, you guys, and just move ahead. And so we really, we were coming together every month as a large group, every week as a in the state capitol lobby team to coordinate. And that was our moment to look each other in the eye and say, hey, some of the programs are in and some are not. Are we going to stick together? And I think because we'd been working together for almost 1.5 years at that point, people agreed to stick together. And so we had the opportunity to pivot our talking points and hit on some of the things that were being missed. And so everybody started carrying the message. Learning begins at birth, not at kindergarten or even at preschool. We all started carrying the message that child development happens in families in addition to their early care and education settings. And so we can't have a Student Success Act that doesn't include a partnership with families for starting from birth. And that early care and education is a system. So we, one of my favorite advocates from Alabama, she always said, you know, this is like a recipe, it's not a menu. You don't get to pick what you want. All of the ingredients combine to get us to our goal. And so we started carrying those messages together around the building and really saw, as we were all saying the same thing and legislators were meeting with all of us, really saw the messaging back from them start to pivot to reflect what we were saying. You see a great photo here. This is the first time we had a shared advocacy day. So Head Start is in that photo, Relief Nurseries are in that photo, Healthy Families is in that photo. So all of the early childhood advocates joined together. We all had our separate lobby days too, but we all joined together for one lobby day where we all could work in this coordinated fashion. So now I'll talk to you about what we won. So the Student Success Act was a $1 billion annual tax increase. 50% of the money goes to school districts, K through 12, to do equity initiatives, although those school districts can spend some of their dollars on early childhood as well. Up to 30% of the money goes to the State Department of Education to do statewide equity initiatives, such as, like, we have an African American Student Success Plan, Native American Student Success Plan. We have an initiative to expand access to school meals, et cetera. So we have statewide initiatives. And then finally, a minimum of 20% of the funds that come in must be dedicated to early childhood in the early learning account. So I'll show the details of how that money was dedicated in its first year. So you can see we really held the comprehensive system support to heart as we talked about what investments were needed. And I think it was very overwhelming to legislators to say, like, wait, you want this to go to 12 different places, all these different programs. We don't even know what some of these are. But the power was that we had more than 40 advocacy organizations, the governor's office and the early learning division saying, like, we know you don't understand all of these, but everyone who understands them agrees this is the right investment to make. And I think that's what got us across the line. The ones that are circled in yellow, these are the infant and toddler components of the investment. So Healthy Families Oregon is our statewide home visiting program. Relief Nurseries, our intensive child abuse prevention strategy. Early Head Start, you're all familiar with. And I will say, with Early Head Start and with our state Head Start investment, we grew slots, yes, but we also set a priority to increase wages in those programs before we grew any slots. So some of that money is slots and some of it is pay. And then early intervention, early childhood special ed is our, our infant, toddler, and preschool age special ed investment. And it's a joint program, but serves infants and toddlers in Oregon. So that was the final package. Now you can advance. So how did we pay? Oh, and I will say, we were trying to get an infant, toddler, childcare investment in the mix as well. And we just couldn't get legislators to the place of understanding the role of childcare in school readiness in that 6-month legislative session. They just couldn't get there. So that's an ongoing effort that I'll come back to in a minute. So we paid for this $1 billion annual tax increase with a new corporate tax. Our context was that Oregon's corporate taxes are very low, some of the lowest in the nation compared to other states. There had been a big ballot measure to increase corporate taxes by $3 billion a year that failed. And the business community hated that ballot measure and the way the corporate tax was structured in that. And so the legislature built this corporate tax to respond to the concerns from the business community. So this is a broad-based tax. Most businesses pay something. It has a very low rate. There's some write-offs for the smallest businesses and for businesses that where a huge percentage of their expenses are wages. So you can see that's where your first 1 million does not get taxed. And this is on revenue. So all the revenue that comes into the business, then you can write off some of that revenue. Then everything that you have left in terms of revenue is taxed at this low rate of 0.57%. We also, as a sweetener to the public, because we were anticipating this would be referred to voters. It was not, but we thought it would be. They did a small personal income tax reduction, which garnered us some support in the public in case we had to fight this at the ballot. So we lost some money. So this actually raises more than $1 billion a year, but $1 billion is left over after you make up for the lost income tax revenue. So we can move forward. The last thing I'll say is that one other piece of context was that this was a huge session for young children in Oregon. The Student Success Act was kind of the most prominent investment, but we also passed universally offered home visiting. So every new family in Oregon in the next 6 years will start receiving an offer to have a home visit from a nurse after their baby's born. We passed a child care task force because we said, listen, you're not investing in child care in the Student Success Act. We need to come back to this. So we'll come back to this next session with the recommendations from that group. The business community was also fighting paid family and medical leave bill that's paid for by a payroll tax, like unemployment insurance. So they were, kind of having to battle on multiple fronts. And then we increased the earned income tax credit for 0 to 3-year-olds. And then my last slide is just the latest Oregon win that you saw on Elizabeth's map, which is that Multnomah County, where Portland sits, just passed a universal preschool ballot measure in November. This tax raises $130 million a year. $20 million of the funds each year will be set aside to support infant and toddler childcare. And the measure is funded with an income tax on high income earners above $125,000 for an individual and $200,000 for a household. And it won with 64% of the vote, to Elizabeth's point, in the middle of a pandemic following massive wildfires and significant displacement among Oregonians. Nonetheless, Multnomah County voters came out and voted in huge support for this measure to raise taxes on those who are thriving during these incredibly tough times. So we're excited to report that.
Oops, great. Thank you so much. I know that there are questions piling up in the chat for both of you, but we're going to continue to move forward because we have a number of speakers here in Minnesota as well that we want to get to. So first up is Lars Nexted with Isaiah. So go ahead and put your questions in the chat. We'll come back to those at the very end. And then we'll also keep track of those questions in case we don't get to all of them today. So Lars, it's up to you. And then Dana, will you mute yourself to come off? Okay.
Thanks, Laura. Exciting to be here. Thank you, Laura and Deb, for organizing this and for inviting me to speak. I have kids distance learning at home, and so we never know whether I might get interrupted with some background noise, so I apologize for that. So real quick, Lars Nexted, use he, him pronouns. I'm with Isaiah. I'm the policy director. Isaiah is a statewide faith-based organization of clergy, congregations, and people of faith working for racial and economic justice. And about 3 or 4 years ago, we formed the Kids Count on Us coalition of over 200 childcare providers. We also have a 501c4 arm called Faith in Minnesota that I'll be referring to as well. And today I'm just going to talk very briefly about an alignment of our organization with two of the largest, two of the largest, excuse me, labor organizations in the state of Minnesota, the Service Employees International Union Healthcare Minnesota, which represents about 35,000 healthcare and long-term care employees, and Education Minnesota, which is the union of 90,000 educators in Minnesota. So we came together about a year ago to form a new alignment of organizations. We're calling ourselves We Make Minnesota. And the reason we came together is we have a shared approach, including a commitment to organizing people into action and leadership, kind of an emphasis on grassroots leadership. We have shared values, both in that Minnesota is a place of abundance and there is enough resources to go around to take care of all of our needs if people share. And secondly, racial equity being essential, and that tax and budget policy has been a way in which white supremacy has frankly been upheld. So we're interested in disrupting and dismantling that. And then thirdly, we have a shared analysis, which is that in terms of, that budgets essentially are a moral document, and we need to interrupt the ways in which education and HHS chunks of the budget are pitted against each other. We can't afford to pit our children and our families against our seniors and our disabled. And that if we raise enough revenue from the wealthy and from corporations, that's both kind of a moral imperative, but it's also politically very popular, and we should be doing it. So recognizing that none of our organizations are policy shops focusing on tax policy, we set out to find some expertise and brought on a researcher named Eric Harris-Bernstein, who is joining us by phone on this webinar right now, to do kind of a deep dive into generating a bold and ambitious list of revenue options and proposals. So we came up with a very ambitious and well-researched set of proposals that could generate billions of dollars in new revenue. This is a feasible, a plausible, and very defensible set of proposals. It includes expanding income taxes on the wealthy, including a millionaire's tax. I was glad to see that on Elizabeth's list. Includes, restoring some of the cuts and raising the estate tax, which has been cut now 3 times over the past decade, down to the point where it only applies to about 200 of the wealthiest families in Minnesota, and raising corporate taxes, which again have benefited greatly from federal tax cuts and state tax cuts over the past years. So Eric's with us to provide some ongoing expertise through this session. And the 3 organizations, SEIU, Edmin, and Isaiah, have committed to a joint campaign around revenue, including some shared resources for continued grassroots organizing to mobilize constituents in support of these increases, polling and message testing and communication support for the campaign as well. So I just wanted to kind of add 2 related efforts that are overlapping with this. One, of course, is the Minnesotans for Paid Family and Medical Leave Coalition, which we co-chair along with Children's Defense Fund Minnesota. We've been together now 6 years pushing for paid family and medical leave. We've passed a bill in the Senate. We've passed a bill in the House. We're still working to pass the bill in both in the same session. And we're going to continue to be pressing on that. And we regard paid family and medical leave, especially for those crucial early months, as a key part of solving our childcare crisis in the state. Secondly, I wanted to mention that Isaiah came together with Education Minnesota's EPIC process, which is a participatory research, policy research and development process involving stakeholders. So early childhood educators and childcare providers came together to study the problem and generate solutions. So there's a forthcoming paper coming this fall that will propose an overhaul of our prenatal to 5 early care and education system, really seeking to break down kind of a false distinction between care and education, which is part of that fragmented nature that we share here in Minnesota that we heard about in Oregon, of some of the barriers that have gotten in front in the way of our community advocating more successfully. No, we're running a little over time. I'm going to wrap it up there, but happy to answer any questions, and so grateful to be part of this big effort.
Great. The gift of a minute. Thank you, Lars. Covered a lot, and we have an extra minute. Okay. Thank you very much. So up next, we have Betsy Hammer with the Minnesota Budget Project. And Lars, if you will mute yourself, Betsy, if you unmute yourself, you have the floor.
All right. Thank you, Laura, and thanks for the reminder to unmute. Thank you also for having me and putting together this excellent session. It's really exciting to think big and hear about some successes and some exciting opportunities. I'm Betsy Hammer. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a policy advocate with the Minnesota Budget Project. We use research, advocacy, and strategic communications to pursue goals that make Minnesota a place where everybody can thrive. So Laura, if you could advance one slide, thank you. Because I work at the Budget Project and I just can't help myself, I'm going to do a little bit of context setting about Minnesota's state budget landscape, what we know now. The current biennium, we've got a $2.4 billion shortfall. That's the biennium that ends next summer. And the projected, or the future biennium, we've got about a $4.7 billion budget shortfall. So that's the equivalent of about 9% of the biennial budget, using a really squishy estimate. Those shortfalls are largely a reflection of the huge drop in revenues that we've seen during the pandemic and the recession that accompanied it. But there's still a lot of uncertainty on the horizon that will impact budget decisions. The big one, will we get any additional federal support? What would it look like? We expect that to come no sooner than early 2021, though maybe. I know there's kind of some eternal hope going on with the lame duck Congress session. And then we've also still got some really important additional information coming out soon about the state's budget situation. So we've got the November 2020 forecast that typically comes out the first week of December. And then we'll also get a forecast in February of 2021. So those will be points in time where the state budget experts at MMB produce and update their projections both on the spending and revenue side. So not trying to be a downer, just trying to be realistic about the landscape of where we are and some of the challenges that are going along with that. You can go ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is probably really tiny to read, but I wanted to throw it up there. We've got a larger version on our website, and if anyone would like me to set it out, I'm happy to send that to Laura and get it distributed. But kind of just an overview of what the state's budget process looks like. So right now we're in the phase where agencies and the governor and MMB are working on their proposals of what the governor will propose in his January budget. That's a date set in the state constitution. And the governor has to present a budget that is balanced based on the November forecast. So taking into consideration that really large $4.7 billion shortfall, the budget has to be balanced. Then we head into the legislative process, and also the legislature needs to pass a budget that is balanced. That's the process I think we're all really familiar with. It's very public. And then the next fiscal year will start on July 1st of 2021. So as we think about this at the Budget Project, this year is especially challenging in a lot of different ways. And we sort of see it as a balance of taking those budget shortfalls very, very seriously, while also acting on the serious challenges that we're facing in terms of public health, the economy, and the ability of folks to get what they need in order to make ends meet. I also realize this is a call focused on childcare, and I'm going to talk a little more specifically about childcare in a moment. But this is a moment in time where there's a lot going on for policymakers. And so just kind of thinking about that big picture, we realize that there are some very serious economic challenges, but there's also a lot of other stuff going on that folks need. So budget shortfalls of the size that we're facing this year put huge pressure on policymakers and can lead to really damaging budget cuts. Sorry, Laura, could you advance to the next slide? Thank you. And budget cuts that can harm the ability of people to thrive. So safety net programs that get cut in ways that leave folks without what they need. But also we've seen this happen before, and I think some other folks on the call mentioned it, that sometimes we see efforts to limit costs during budget crises that stick around for a really long time. So some of these cuts to childcare assistance that were made close to 20 years ago are still with us in terms of shrunken eligibility, increased co-payments for families, additional bureaucratic hoops that make it harder for folks to get the assistance that they need. All of those measures remained in place even after the economy and the state budget outlook fully recovered. Minnesota's funding for basic sliding fee childcare assistance decreased by about 25% since fiscal year 2003 when we're taking inflation into account. So there's a huge need out there. And childcare is still really unaffordable for many folks. infant care childcare costs are more than a third of the total income for a median wage worker in Minnesota. So as we head into this challenging state budget situation, we're trying to keep all these things in mind. And we've seen in the past that we can have a bigger impact when we collectively put up a united front against large budget cuts. So at the Budget Project, we think we really need some alternatives to balancing the budget through cuts only. And of course, that means revenues. That's what we're talking about on this call. We also think that the state needs to draw on the budget reserve. That's what it's there for. Policymakers have done a really excellent job of using the good times to build up that budget reserve and create a rainy day fund. I think we're in that rainy day. We also think we need to maximize federal dollars, which I know folks on this group have done a lot, specifically related to childcare. There's other opportunities for maximizing federal dollars, as well as raising state revenues. So we don't have a specific presentation on this yet, but the Minnesota Budget Project and others are starting to work on some of these revenue raising efforts. We've had a little bit of conversation. It's still in the very early days, but it is something that we are going to be working on. And if you are interested or you'd like to learn more or be part of that, please reach out to myself or to Nan Madden. I think I'm good on time, so I'm going to stop there, but happy to answer any questions in the chat box or later.
Great. Thank you so much, Betsy. Lots of great information in such a short amount of time. Okay, so next up, we have Deb Fitzpatrick. She is the Policy and Legislative Affairs Director with the Children's Defense Fund Minnesota, and she is going to share with us information about universal family care. So Betsy, if you want to mute yourself, Deb, if you unmute, and then you are ready to go.
All right, thanks everybody. This slide's a little misleading. It has Ben's name on it, but I am using his slides from a presentation that we did to the legislature in January of last year, pre-COVID lockdown. And I wanted to just use those slides and recognize his leadership and role. Also wanted to call out that Take Action Minnesota is the partner of Caring Across Generations, which has been advancing this framework nationally and in Minnesota. Next slide. So universal family care is this infrastructure, again, that is looking at, improving care across the lifespan. So it's a framework that really, in a different way, some of the models that we've talked about already today bring together K-12 education and early care and education. This framework really brings together care across the generations as a model and looks at those as an insurable risk, and recognizes that families experience these needs for long-term care, paid family medical leave, and early care and education as interconnected kind of pieces of their lives, and that there's synergies in addressing them together, and that states have an important role to play in thinking about how these things come together for families. Next slide. So the National Academy of Social Insurance did put together an amazing panel that then they teamed up with Caring Across Generations to advance this model. So it's really grounded in a lot of research around how social insurance might be deployed as a framework for addressing these needs families and the state has. Next slide, please. So social insurance, for those of you who are not as familiar with that idea, and it's often not one we think about in the early care and education framework, is really, probably the most common ones that people are familiar with are unemployment insurance or Social Security. The idea here is that people contribute while they're working, and then everyone has the opportunity to benefit from those contributions over a lifetime. Next slide, please. And so within this framework, we're looking at really coming up with a program, a social insurance program that would deal with 3 different care needs. First of all, early care and education, which is what we're talking about today, but also paid family and medical leave and long-term services and supports. Next slide, please. And the pillars of this idea, right, are that kind of work is the foundation, that this is a program that helps people work and enables people to work, that is portable and flexible, so it's not attached to a particular job, that there's a single access point for a variety of these different supports. Again, that families have these needs throughout their lifespan and they intersect with each other. And it also is a framework that it recognizes the value of care, whether it's done by people in the paid labor force or it's done within our own families. Next slide, please. So again, some of the case for an integrated universal approach such as this is, that we're all juggling work and care, that there are more efficient ways to pay for care, that, we need to deal with we need to create a more family-friendly economy where families can focus on one another during these care situations in their lives. And that we could aspire to having more of a one-stop shop kind of approach where families can access a variety of supports all at once and through one kind of framework. Next slide, please. So we're here to talk about financing. So there's a lot of different ways that you might finance this, but I'm going to show you one that that is in this National Academy of Social Insurance report as a model. And again, the idea here is that these three types of support for families would be provided through a payroll tax, which could be structured in a variety of ways. Generally speaking, payroll taxes are perceived as a little more regressive than some other ways of doing it. So there's ways to think about, like with the Medicare tax, adding an additional rate on the top to bring the overall rate down for all workers. There's ways to think about sharing these costs across employers and employees. And so just wanting to think about, there's a lot of different ways that this might be structured, but the general idea for this particular framework is to fund this through a payroll tax, which again is a model, social insurance model, where everyone is contributing and everyone then has the opportunity to benefit. Next slide, please. So that modeling that I just showed is based on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, Medicine, Transforming the Financing of Early Care and Education package that I know groups in Minnesota have been working with as well to come up with ideas about how much it would cost for us to fully fund a proposal. And just wanted to mention that we have done cost modeling for the Paid Family and Medical Leave program in Minnesota. And just for reference sake, at the 0.7 payroll tax on Minnesota Social Security wage base, for example, raises around $925 million annually. So it's a significant chunk of change that could contribute to supporting ECE. Next slide, please. So some of you may be asking, this is based on people who work, right? And it is in a strictest sense is a contributory social insurance approach where people pay in, they're working, and they pay into the trust fund and then they can use it. But there are models where we could create a comprehensive approach that would combine those payroll taxes with other dedicated revenue sources. And both of those then would go into a trust fund that then could benefit all residents, again, whether they have a work history or have contributed through their working career to this fund. Next slide, please. So again, I think this is just one way among many to think about creating a dedicated sustainable revenue source. It does help us link across generations, potentially reducing competition among segments of the population. It's an earned benefit approach, which could generate stronger political support and maybe greater stability over time. It does build on a lot of work to kind of create a more coherent system. And it would generate the necessary funding to fully fund or close to fully fund the modeling that Krista Anders and her financing work group has put forward at a basic level. So one more, keep going. Let's go one more. And I just wanted to lift up Washington State as a model that has advanced 2 parts of this package and is now working on the 3rd. And they have a task force and a commitment in their statutes to reach by 2025 a system that ensures every family is only paying a maximum of 7% of their family income to receive care and education. So I'll stop there and we can turn it over for just a few minutes of questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Deb. I know that was a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So we do have a little bit of time for some question and answer. And as you want to, if you could put your questions into the chat box, and then I actually would like Elizabeth to speak to the special taxing districts, because I know we didn't get a chance to talk through that menu of potential options. So.
Yeah, just really quick. I mean, because you saw the viability of these things even more so at the local level in recent years. One immediate thing that the state can do as you work on big state revenue is pass state enabling legislation that would allow localities to sort of go forth and do things like what Multnomah County did. And I just wanted to call your attention. So in Minnesota, from our read, you can create special taxing districts for river watershed, airports, metropolitan areas, mosquito control, soil and water, blah, 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 right? All these sort of essential services. And you can't do it for children. There are examples of states that have that kind of legislation. And I just think it might be a quick and easy, relatively speaking, option that you could take on while you work on the big revenue.
Great, thank you. There is one quick question also for you, Elizabeth, about the opioid settlement. Have you seen other states trying to get at the table and being part of that conversation?
I just know that from my experience in Missouri as an advocate who was working on when the tobacco settlement, master settlement agreement happened, kids were late to the table, and folks got their sort of claws into that money, and it was harder to get in there after the fact. So I would just encourage people to find out, and I'm sure the Children's Cabinet folks know, where those conversations are happening and what that's going to mean for Minnesota, but just be in those conversations, because obviously kids are impacted by the opioid crisis in pretty deep ways.
Great, thank you. And then Dana, just for you, one last question, if you would. You spoke about your financing strategy using taxes, corporate tax, but you also paid attention to what the public might need to sign on to raising this new revenue source. Could you just, in the last minute, just speak a little bit about why you felt that was important to have both of those strategies in place?
Yeah, well, Oregon is just set up to make it very easy to get ballot measures on the ballot. We do a lot of legislating by ballot measure here. And so we always have to be prepared for that. That legislating by ballot measure has really shaped our tax system. So we have a constitutional prohibition against sales tax in our Oregon Constitution. We have property tax caps in our Oregon Constitution that have been passed by voters at the ballot. And it is a very low bar in terms of the number of signatures that need to be collected in order to refer something to the Oregon ballot. So we knew that it would be easy if corporations who were going to pay the tax decided that they wanted to. It would be easy for them to take this measure and take it to the ballot. And so that was a part of our strategy, the whole campaign, knowing that even if we were successful in getting enough legislative support, that we might also, after we did that, have to pass the measure at the ballot. And so the whole time, those among the larger, coalition, including K-12, we're doing public opinion polling on the measure as it was developing and evolving to make sure they felt they could win the campaign with voters as well.
Great. Thank you. I wish we had more time, but to Dana's point, we know a number of our next steps. We have a number of them to get us started. This is really just to help begin the conversation here in Minnesota. Moving forward, we plan to develop a steering committee to help us work through this. We know we need to raise funds to help manage the working group, campaign development. We also want to do some polling, although it's not spelled correctly, and partner recruitment. We will have a working group looking at the different funding sources. And then we want to be in parallel or collaborative effort with our Transforming the Financing of Early Care and Education work group. So those are our next steps that we've outlined. We would love to have your involvement if you're at all interested. I know some of you have been talking about this off and on over the number of years. You can reach myself or Deb Fitzpatrick directly, or you can put it in the chat box that you would like additional information or would like to take part in this effort going forward. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. This was a very quick session, but hopefully we'll be able to pull on the expertise of our friends, Dana and Elizabeth, and all of our friends here in Minnesota with Lars, Betsy, and Deb. So thank you everybody for joining us. Be well, and hope your week starts out wonderful.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. Bye-bye.